Okay, welcome everyone to the first Finance Committee meeting of the year. On our agenda tonight, we have the FY21 budget to actuals mid-year update, a discussion of food services and Breathe program revenue status, update on federal funding, and a preliminary FY22 budget discussion. So I will just go ahead and turn it over to Miranda.
Okay, thanks. Good evening, everyone. I will just share my screen.
Can I just quickly point out that Kathy Winchenbach, our new incoming Executive Director for Budget and Finance, is in the attendees. I asked her to, if she had the time and bandwidth this afternoon to join us, because there's a lot of material that we're covering that is important for her to get an introduction. So Kathy, thank you for being here, and we look forward to having you formally meet the board at the meeting next week, but we appreciate you being here today.
Can everybody see my screen? Okay. All right, so you just went over the agenda for me, Anna, but let me just point out that we, since publishing the agenda, for a couple of reasons, made a little bit of a change. We're going to push the more in-depth discussion of the Breathe program to next month for a couple of reasons. Number one, we just thought with a little more time, we could do a more thorough memo and be better prepared for that discussion. Additionally, since we set the original agenda, the last two items kind of took on a new life and are a little bit bigger than expected. So we just, honestly, I just felt like we had a little too much on this agenda in the end. So I went ahead and decided to postpone that. Hopefully that's okay with everybody. But like last year, we'll still have a full comprehensive memo for you on Breathe specifically, and we'll just have that for you at the next meeting or before. Okay, so yeah, we're going to start with mid-year budget to actuals, go into a discussion of food services. Right after that, it'll flow right into that, and then we'll kind of hit the other two different topics, federal funding and the FY22 budget. Okay, so starting with mid-year budget to actuals. So just to reground you in what our budget is this year, it's just a hair under 120 million. And so at this point in the year, we've spent about 46% of the budget. And as I said in the memo, and I should note, there's a long, dense and dry memo attached to the materials. I'm not sure to what extent you guys have been able to review that, but I'm going to try to go through this.
Very mean to yourself. I read it at like 9:30 last night, and it was totally not dense, and it was totally very coherent and very clear. So, folks, if you haven't read it yet, read it tonight.
I fully agree with the superintendent. I found it very readable. So thank you for all the work that enabled it to be very readable.
Oh, good. That is nice to hear then. I'm glad people read it as well. But in any case, I might go a little faster just because that does exist. I want to get to our other topics. But basically, usually we would expect to be about 45 to 50% spent or so because, a lot of our costs, we are halfway through the year, but the summer months we spend less. So it's not quite, we wouldn't expect quite a 50% spend right now. Usually expect about 45 to 50%. And we're at 46. But this year, which was different from last year, this year, we have actually had more than half of our debt service allocated at this point in the year. And again, it's just kind of funky how the city sort of does the timing. Last year at this point, we had like 10% allocated, and it's not, doesn't mean anything. It's just, but it's a big thing that has different timing year over year. So I like to control for that when we're comparing year over year spend. And additionally, this year, we had 3 pay runs in December, whereas last year we had 3 pay runs in January. So it kind of front loaded our payroll costs a little bit. So controlling for those variables, we've spent about 44.5% versus last year's 45.5%. So we're actually tracking about 1% lower than last year, which doesn't seem like much. But when you think about, the size of our budget, what 1% means, and also the fact that we're only halfway through the year. So if we've spent 1%, less in the first half, that's going to be 2% in the total spend for the year versus last year. 2% of our budget is about $2.4 million. So, it's significant. It's a significant lesser spend. And really, my point here is just to kind of show that this is consistent data with what we've been talking about for the last month or so in terms of being able to absorb some of our CRF continuation costs on our local budget. And so this is kind of just showing you in a different way how we kind of came to some of those conclusions. And talk about why, where we're seeing savings. And it's all going to be stuff you've heard before. A lot of pandemic related savings supporting that. So on the revenue side, we've collected 48.5%, about $58 million, 49% of general fund revenues, 59% of adult ed, mainly because they get their EPS subsidy in one lump sum up front. So that's why you're seeing a higher percentage there. And then food services, as we'll talk about a little bit later, we're seeing a significant projected shortfall there. We've only collected about 22% of revenues. And this is a familiar story, I think, from last spring with the pandemic, but we'll talk about that in a little more detail on the next couple slides. So on the expenditure side, like I said, this is a familiar story because we've had this discussion in other meetings, but we're seeing some surpluses, largely pandemic-related savings in a few areas: subs and temp salaries, student transportation, field trips and athletics, staff travel and parking, and then not related to the pandemic, we have the budget for school resource officers unspent. I didn't note it here, but the board contingency hasn't been spent or allocated yet. And then we have some regular salaries and benefits surplus, and part of that is, as I've noted previously, the little swap we did with some costs being able to be moved on to Title I. And then there's also just the fact that, most of our extra costs this year have all been pandemic related, and those costs have therefore been allocable to our federal funds. And so we haven't, seen positions being added to our local budget. They've mostly been added to federal funding. So we have some kind of just general turnover surplus in regular salaries and benefits as well. And finally, food services, we are seeing significant kind of underspending percentage-wise in food services, food and other supplies costs, which is basically the flip side of the revenue shortage, just fewer meals being served. And that will go to offset some of the revenue deficit that we're seeing in food services. So, and then in general, we're not seeing anywhere that's looking surprising or looking like we're going to be going over budget in kind of our standard operating. So there's really not a whole lot to note on the deficit side, which is great. Any questions on the expenditures? So the revenue side is not as good, but the more interesting story, I guess. There's more to see here. Unfortunately, it's all deficits. But I want to just, before we get into this, so nobody's panicking if they haven't read my memo yet. With the news with extended and additional federal funding, I'm comfortable that we're going to be able to make space on our local budget to be able to offset these deficits that we're seeing. We can't actually charge these things directly to federal funding, but what we can do is, as I've been terming it, is kind of make space on our budget to offset and be able to preserve our fund balances, even more so than we were hoping before we knew about some of these. So first of all, we've talked about the pre-K EPS deficit. So because of the general downward enrollment trends this year, we didn't meet the threshold that we needed to be able to retain the expansion funding that we received for pre-K, even though we did expand the classrooms. I think we've discussed this before, but unfortunately that means we're going to lose $300,000 in our EPS this year. And that is sort of effectively going to be split so close to in half between this year and next year, just because of the way an unrelated adjustment is playing out, which is fine. It really doesn't matter when it hits us. It's going to be $300,000 less that we get from the state that ultimately will, trickle down to our fund balance. So timing isn't terribly important, but that's how you'll see it play out in the actuals. State agency client revenue, kind of like Breathe and Maine Care, there's a variety of challenges associated with remote instruction that caused that reimbursement to be lower than expected. And Breathe, Maine Care, we're expecting another deficit shortfall again this year versus projections. And I don't want to get too deep into the details because we're going to talk about that at a future meeting, but I did want to make sure really here to just let you guys know what we expect kind of the final net impact to be this year on our revenue situation. It's a manageable deficit. It's not, it's not what we want, but it's it's a deficit that we can manage with our existing fund balances and also with the Medicaid funds that we have been talking about recently that we have in reserve as well. If we need to use those, we can. Not that I would suggest that we do unless we need to, but those are available as well. So, and then finally, I think the one we want to talk about in most detail is the food services deficit. So, basically, Jane and I have looked at the numbers. We have data to go on now. We're 3 months in. We have 3 months of actual revenue, and then Jane has projections for December. Basically, what we're looking at is approximately a $1.5 million revenue deficit, offset by what we expect to be approximately $750,000 in supplies and food savings and cost savings offsets, which leaves us with a gap of about $750,000. So, this is, I'll turn it over to Jane shortly to describe, some of the factors and context behind this. Obviously, fewer students in school, decreased participation, while a lot of the costs, are structural, remaining the same. We're just getting less in reimbursements. There's no sales revenue. So for all of those reasons. But just to remind folks about the sort of where our fund balance is, what our position is in food services right now, we were in a good position. We have, I think, about a $1.1 million fund balance. But if you think about this $750,000 gap, plus the fact that we have $300,000 of that fund balance budgeted, we actually are, in a position here to wipe out the entire food services fund balance if we do not pursue another, what I would call a bailout, which basically just means charge some stuff for food services on local funds so that we, can preserve their fund balance. And the good news, again, with the federal funding that we have, I think we definitely have space to do that. And we will be planning to do that, reserving some of those funds. Like I say, indirectly, we can't actually charge food services to, we can't use CRF to offset lost revenue. That's one of the rules, but we can certainly charge CRF costs to CRF, making space on our local budget to be able to charge food services costs there and effectively offset the revenue shortfall. And we did this last fiscal year as well. And so I think we just do it again. And, this is a pandemic related shortfall. This is not anything, indicative of structural issues with the program. So hopefully nothing like this will repeat next year. At least we all hope. So that's kind of it for me. I was going to turn it over to Jane and Javier to see if they have anything more to say on food services. And if any of you guys have any questions for me or for Jane with respect to food services or anything else that I talked about, we can go ahead and do that now.
I'm gonna let Jane walk through some of the sort of the fundamental changes that have caused this. But before we do that, I just want to sort of go back, Miranda, to what you just said now in terms of where the money would come from to be able to affect this bailout. And I think what I think is important for the board to understand is if you think about all of the conversations that we've had over the month of December, as we were talking about, the continuation of some of our costs for, the continuation of some of our costs for the community programs, but also all of the things that we've put in place in our schools. So the substitutes, the additional admin supports, and all of those other things. If you'll recall, the bulk of those things were going to be funded with some of the savings in the in general fund that were a part of Miranda's presentation. So, she actually, has a call out in that slide that points out the fact that many of these are the things that you've seen that were going to be used to pay for those programs and services. Because of the additional revenue that we now have, the fact, and we'll be talking about this in detail later, we don't expect that we will need those general funds to be able to continue those. We will be able to charge those to the continuation of CRF. And so for that reason, we feel confident that there's going to be general fund revenue that will allow us to cover this shortfall in the food service budget. So does that? I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. That I was trying to connect those dots for you. So if that's clear, then I think we can move into actually talking about sort of the difference between between FY20 and FY21 in our food service world. And we have both a narrative in the memo that I think many of you have heard already about what's different now, but we also have a spreadsheet that's what's up on the slide that I also think is helpful in terms of helping you to understand the basic dynamics. Jane, do you want to walk through this? Do you want me to walk through it? How do you want to do this?
Either or is fine. I can do it. So what you have on the screen in front of you is a comparison for the fall months from last year to this year, showing the significant difference in the amount of meals served. So as you know, food service revenue comes from the meals that we serve to the students. And with less students in school, we've been able to serve less meals, and thus meaning less revenue coming in. We have been feeding kids everywhere. We've been doing it in the classroom, and we've been doing it on the street corners, and we've been doing it in wraparound care, and we've been doing super snacks. So we've really been trying to find all those avenues to be able to meet the needs of the students and of the district. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to meet the numbers that we've had in the past. So I typically look at October as a great comparison. The months are very similar, and you will see that breakfast and lunch, just about 125,000 meals for last October, and we received funding at a rate about $315,000 for that, versus what we did this year at just under 50,000 meals, and that resulted in the funding reimbursement of 149,000. So it pans out and looks at that total. So we're looking at reimbursements last year at this time of about 100,000 and of about $1 million, and this year at only about 500,000. Our averages at this point in time, when everybody's in school, we're doing about 1,250 breakfasts, and we're doing about 1,400 lunches at that reimbursement rate, which is the rate for the program that we're offering at this point. We should look at seeing another $1 million come in if we were to stay in school from this point forward.
Can I just make a fine point on that? I think it's because you helped me to understand this. This best reimbursement per day that you see at the bottom of this slide assumes that that we don't have any of what we actually have in place tomorrow, which is Reiki being closed, being closed, and a couple of schools having significant portion of the school also quarantined. And so those are meals that we will not be serving. And so right there, that best reimbursement per day that Jane conceived will be decreased by that amount. So that is the sort of the total sum of what would have been possible, which would have brought in somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5 million in revenue, where otherwise the revenue would have been more in the neighborhood of $3 million for the year.
So, on the bright side, we could be getting better and being in school, and we'll hope that happens. we want to stay there. So we'll hope that those numbers we can reach those, or at least strive to reach those numbers as things get better in the spring. Does anybody have any questions? The differences in the reimbursement names are because we're actually operating in a summer food service program at this point in time versus the National School Lunch Program. That's allowing us to give the meals to all the students for free. So they're not paying any money, and we get a slightly higher reimbursement from the feds for that, for each meal that we're serving. And that's why that line is in the bottom half. SFSP is the Summer Food Service Program, which we typically only can offer in the summer. So that was the waiver that allowed us to offer free meals to students during this pandemic.
Are there any questions at this point? I should mention that we do have some board members here who are not part of the finance committee, but typically if there are board members present that have questions, I allow for you to ask questions. All the information that we review here eventually goes back to the board anyway, so it's good for us to kind of hear from everybody that's present. So I'm keeping an eye on the panelists to see if I see any hands raised. I don't see any at this point, but if anybody has any questions, just use the raise your hand feature. I see Adam has a question.
Thank you. Hi, Jane. Thanks for all the work here. I just want to acknowledge that, as it's been said, there's no fault here for what's happening. And I think I'll just want to give voice to what is on the other side of these numbers, which is not concerned necessarily for deficit, but for the fact that there's 150,000 less meals that were served during the same period this year. And that's not for you to solve alone, but I know it wears on your hearts and your efforts to try to get as many meals as many people. But that's really stark to me to see how many fewer meals have gone out in this period of time and what that might mean for our community. It's really something. So just thank you again. And all this is making sense to me so far.
I don't see any other hands at this point.
Okay, so I can continue. I've just got one more thing on kind of this section of the agenda, just kind of a note here at the tail end. So I wanted to make sure that everyone was sort of in the loop on this. I know some of you have had conversations. We've had conversations with you already, but so basically at this point, we are slated to be on the council's agenda, the city council's agenda next Wednesday, the 20th. To request that the council authorize the board to approve budget transfers greater than 5% if we need that to happen this year. Basically, right now, state statute limits the percent that we can transfer from any one category to another to 5%, which is really, if you think about the size of some of the 11 state category budgets, I mean, I think I wish I should have pulled it up, but it's a massive percentage is in one category, regular instruction. So when we have savings in other areas, 5% is quite limiting. And the composition of our budget is just so different than, I should say the composition of our expenditures in some ways is very different than how we budgeted, and much more so this year than really any other year I think that we've probably ever seen. And so it's really for this reason. I've been planning to do this for a while, and I really needed to do it when we passed the plan in December to shift all those CRF costs onto local. So I was concerned we were going to need to have transfers greater than 5%. It's less critical that we do it now that we do have this news of federal funding. We have a bit more flexibility, but I still think we may need to, and it would just be so helpful to remove that layer of complexity to be able to just manage the federal funds in the most efficient and effective way possible. So I figured we might as well go ahead and move forward. It was already on the agenda. And what am I forgetting? I feel like I had something else to say about that, but what I just wanted to say is that we were advised by Drummond Woodsum that the council has the authority to authorize the board to actually be able to approve the transfers of greater than 5%. The council would just be extending this authority for this year. And then we would still need to come to the board to actually do any of those transfers. They wouldn't be approving any specific transfers. They would simply be allowing us to do so. Basically, just one example I want to give of kind of why we needed to do this, or why I still think we might need to make use of them, and that's really food services. So if we want to ultimately cover 800,000, possibly $1 million, depending on what we have left over in food services shortfall this year, we basically would have $1 million worth of unbudgeted expense in category 11, which is all other expenditures. So we would need to move $1 million from other categories, and we're seeing savings in categories that are quite small. So transportation and other instruction together is a pretty small budget. I want to say it's a little under 6 million. And so 5% of that is only 280,000. We're seeing more like 600,000 in savings there. So basically the difference of 300,000 between what we could move versus, what we're saving, we'd be restricted. We wouldn't be able to use that to kind of bail out, I don't want to keep using the word bailout. It's a bad term, but it's just for some reason what I keep saying, but to help out food services. So, why leave that constraint in place, right? I mean, this is an unprecedented year. So I'm hoping that it'll be a simple discussion with the council. We'll see, but I just wanted to make sure everybody was in the loop on this. And I believe there's been conversations. Javier, did you want to jump in?
Just to sort of point out, you may have said this, that under normal circumstances, sort of if we could only move 300,000 instead of 600,000, which is what we would project to save in those categories, that money would go to our reserves, so it doesn't get lost or anything. So if the council did not agree to this, it would just mean that money would go into our reserves. But obviously, in this particular instance, it makes a lot more sense for all the reasons that Miranda is describing, for us to be able to redeploy it this year as opposed to have it go into our reserves for future years.
So Emily and I talked about this, and I'm going to plan to be at the city's, is it the city finance committee meeting?
It's a council meeting, but it's a holiday, so it falls on a Wednesday. Monday's a holiday, so that's where they rescheduled to the Wednesday. I think the finance committee meets on Wednesdays or Thursdays, but yeah, that's why there's a Wednesday council meeting.
So I'll plan to be there for that agenda item. And just to kind of clarify that it's 5%. So this is in the event that we need to make a transfer somewhere within our operating budget of an amount that is equal to 5% of the total budget. Is that what it is?
So the 11 state categories that we budget, we officially vote in. The referendum is in the 11 state categories, and it's a page in our budget. I can pull it up if you. Do you want me to pull it up, or?
We don't need to.
Okay, it's the state mandated 11 categories. If we want to move 5% from any given line, from one budget to another, we can move everything to one place and move more than 5% to a line. We can't move more than 5% from a line. And so these lines that are fairly small, but we're seeing large savings this year, like disproportionately large savings versus other lines, that's where we're running into, the problem is like we're seeing savings in athletics and transportation, and these are small lines. Category 1, regular instruction, is where almost all of our costs are, and that's where all of our extra costs are too. So we're moving stuff from small lines to this big line. So I'm just concerned about that, about funds being held back and restricted and not being able to be utilized in the most effective and efficient way. And
so if they approve this, we would be able to do that as many times during the fiscal year as we needed to.
Yes, and most likely, like I do, like we do every year, we would just come to you at the end of the year with one request. And if it ended up being more than 5%, that would be okay. It may not. At the end of the day, I just don't know right now. But if it were to, we wouldn't have to then say we can't do it. So that's the idea.
Okay. Makes sense to me. Any questions on that? I don't see any.
Okay, so I'm going to move into the federal funding landscape next. I just want to say, Jane, thank you for your participation tonight. You are welcome to stay, but I don't want you to feel like you have to. So at this point, you're more than welcome to sign off at your leisure. All right. Sounds like we're past the comments and questions here. Stop me if I'm wrong. So moving into the federal funding. So I just kind of wanted, I see a hand.
Roberto, go ahead.
It's just real quick before we move on. Miranda, you mentioned that we'll get a chance to talk about the Maine Care reimbursement at another time. Are we going to do that? Maybe this is a question for Javier or Anna. Are we going to do that in one of the next finance meetings?
Yeah.
That's the plan for the next finance committee meeting. We were going to do it today, but there's too much. And then there were some additional pieces that Miranda and the program administration saw, and they decided to push it off into the next meeting.
Excellent. Perfect. Thanks a lot.
All right. So before kind of launching into this discussion, I just wanted to step back for a minute and talk about some of the terms of the funding and some of the labeling that we're using here so that we all know what we're talking about when we talk about it, because at this point, this stuff is going to be around for a while. So we should get used to the terms and the differences in the types of funding that we received. So first and foremost, we were talking about everything as, CARES money this, CARES money that, right? So that was fine at first, but now we need a little more nuance. So CARES, of course, refers to that original act last April, where we received some initial money that we budgeted. And then, CARES also had other funding involved, and it ended up being CRF, and all of this comes from CARES, right? So to be able to distinguish between the different pieces of CARES, I wanted to make the distinction below that really differentiates between CRF, which stands for Coronavirus Relief Funds, and ESSERF, which is probably an acronym that we haven't really used yet because it wasn't really necessary, but it's going to be important now because that's where most of our new funding is. And ESSERF is stands for Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. And so these are really the two pots of funding that we received. So CRF is the money that we received, the giant sum of money that we received this fall and had to spend very, very quickly. And this was money that was actually allocated to the state, and the state redirected it to education, at Governor Mills' discretion. And those funds are actually at the federal level administered through the Treasury. So they have completely different stipulations and terms on them versus the ESSER funding. And as you probably recall, we had different layers of CRF funding as well. So we had CRF 1, CRF 2, day programming, and adult ed. So 4 distinct grants. And I'll talk about more about, the terms and the numbers on the next slide. But now I just really wanted to kind of be able for us to all be on the same page in terms of the terminology. So ESSERF, we received the first round of ESSERF in April 2020. That's what we utilized as part of our budget to fund custodians, and also that is part of that is also the $650,000 that we keep referring to as the CARES contingency. That's actually ESSERF. That's ESSERF 1. There was no ESSERF 2 until December, so we didn't call it ESSERF 1 until now, but now it is officially ESSERF 1. And the ESSERF funds are actually, they were stipulated for education by the Fed. So this is money that's coming to K-12 and earmarked for K-12 directly, and it's coming through DOE. So it's a whole different set of stipulations. So the new funding, so it's actually not CARES. I don't even actually know what the term was for December's act. Does anybody know what the name of this act in December was by the Feds? I don't know what it was called, but
I did for 1 minute, but then I also forgot.
Okay. It doesn't have as catchy a name as CARES, but so technically ESSERF 2 is not actually part of CARES. It's part of this.
Heroes?
Heroes was the one I think
Heroes
that
in the
didn't get
House.
passed. Yeah, Heroes never made it through, I don't think. That would have been a good good acronym, and I think that would have been even more money, actually, as well. But
A lot more.
Yeah. So anyway, so SRF2 is technically not part of CARES, not that that really matters, but at the end of the day, SRF2 is what we're, this new funding that we're receiving as part of this most recent legislation. Yeah, just now. So that's SRF2, and that's a large sum of money, as you'll see on the next page. So these are all the different pots of money. I just wanted to make those clarifications. I think I've covered everything I wanted to in this slide. Any questions on this?
I don't see any hands.
Okay.
I have a question.
Okay,
Yes.
Yeah, the SRF, is it related to the pandemic or is something that we get every year?
Yeah, no, it's all pandemic related funding. So the SRF1 came as part of the CARES Act in April, and SRF2 is part of the pandemic stimulus bill that was just passed by Congress in December. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
So none of this we've ever received before. Okay, so this is really a summary to see sort of all of the funding all totaled together, which I hadn't actually myself done and actually added up these numbers until I did this slide, and I thought it was quite remarkable to see that $23.5 million at the bottom of the slide in terms of how much we've actually been allocated to this point. So CRF, again, was the money that we received in the fall. Our allocations through all four of those grants were $14 million originally. You may recall we didn't claim all of that because we could not realistically spend it before the original deadline, which was December 30th. But we heard news just this week that we will, and not only has the funding been extended until 6/30/2021, so if we had remaining balances, we could continue to utilize it, but we're going to be able to claim the funds that we previously did not claim. So we're going to be able to access the full original allocations. So what that means is in the second column, balance available or expected balance, for CRF1, we really don't have much left. We have just small balances that were left over, but we can continue to utilize. CRF2 is the big story. So we have about 700,000 or so left over from what we claimed that we'll continue to be able to use, and then we will be able to access the 3.6 million or so that we didn't previously access or budget before December 30th. So we're going to go ahead and submit a new budget for that and be able to access that money. So that gives us basically $4.5 million to be able to, fund those continuation costs and do some other things, which we'll talk about on the next slide. All of this money. So the federal legislation in December actually extended the CRF deadline to December 31 of 2021, but the state has actually only extended it through June 30th of 2021. So we're going by that and expecting and planning to spend these funds this fiscal year. So for SRF, we had our original allocation last April of about $1.9 million. And as of today, although we have, previously budgeted it to spend on continuation costs, technically today we still have, the $650,000 contingency left over. So that's what you're seeing there under SRF1 balance available. That's what we've been referring to this point as the CARES contingency. And that end date is the end of FY22. So if we don't spend it this year, we can carry it into next year. And then SRF2 is, of course, the other big new story, which was part of the December legislation. This is an estimated figure. I should say it depends on who is reporting the information and the projections. Sometimes it sounds like it's a little less than 4 times our allocation. Sometimes it sounds like it's a little more. So somewhere between $7 to $8 million for this allocation is the expectation. I've put 7.5 here. Hopefully that's close to where it lands. But we should really be hearing about that very, very soon, either by the end of this week, certainly by the end of the month. The state indicated we'd be hearing. I think they sent a notice out today saying that. So we should know very, very soon what the actual figure is. And, the other great piece of this is that not only can we spend it next year, we can spend it the year after as well. So this is actually funding for the next 2 years. We could spend it today if we needed to, but obviously we're going to be we're going to be spending CRF this year. To the extent we possibly can, we should preserve these other balances to use in future years. So I didn't expect that originally. So it was great news to hear that we could spend SRF 2 all the way into FY23. So total SRF funding at this point has been just a hair under $9.5 million. And we basically, have a large amount of that still available at this point in time. So total allocation, total funding from the federal government and pandemic relief, $23.5 million, with about $12.5 million remaining are available, unexpended at this point. Available for use. So any questions on this?
I see Adam has a question.
Yes, thank you. Trying to raise my hand so I don't slow you down. Just clarifying question, the 650,000 in SF1, is that the same or different contingency as what we put into the local budget? Because it's the same number, I believe.
When you say we put it into the local budget, do you mean we budgeted for it to cover continuation costs in the plan that was proposed in December? Is that what you mean?
No, almost a year ago when we passed the fiscal year budget, there was a COVID contingency line, which was 650,000, I believe. So it's just clarifying if this is a different amount or the same.
It's the same amount. It wasn't technically in the budget, I guess, which is why I was confused by the question. I think we absolutely discussed it as part of the budget process. Technically, it's not part of the budget because it's federal funding, but absolutely, it is the same 650,000. So it's the 1.9 that we were allocated. We budgeted about 1.3 million, slightly less than 1.3 million in custodial costs to it, and left the remaining 650 unallocated so that we would have a contingency fund to the extent we needed to for other things during the year.
Great.
And then can I just add that was projected to be spent when we presented in December on what it would take for us to be able to continue what we did in the first half of the year. And so, again, just to sort of reiterate, I'm harping on this a little bit, but the additional CRF, the CRF2 funding that we are able to access, that we weren't able to apply for in the first go around because we just didn't think that we would be able to spend it. We can now use that, and so that allows us to preserve that 650,000 in SRF1, which is what we previously called CARES contingency. It allows us to preserve that into future years.
Any other questions? I have a couple if nobody else does. I was just wondering what the rationale was for the state to set the deadline at June 30th rather than December.
I don't actually know the answer to that.
No. Yeah. Maybe line up with a fiscal year or something. I don't know. But.
Yeah, I'm really not sure. I mean, it's a good question. Perhaps we should ask. I don't know. It would be interesting to know, and helpful to know if they could potentially, in theory, consider extending it again. And
obviously, one of the reasons we didn't already spend that 4.4 million was because of the restrictions on it. We just couldn't figure out ways to spend it in time. Do we still have the same level of restrictions on these funds? And given that the deadlines have been pushed back, does that alleviate some of the pressure? Do we think that we can reasonably make use of these funds?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first and foremost, all of the things that we discussed at the last board meeting that were, that you approved to continue into the second half of the year, all of those things were things that we paid for with CRF1 and CRF2, and we just couldn't continue to pay for them because the deadline was set at December 30th, and that's why we couldn't. But now we can continue to use that funding, and so that, it doesn't cover all of our costs to continue everything, including the community partners, through the end of the year, but it gets us pretty far. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later. So.
Okay. And then just my last question was, is there any, are we moving stuff off the local budget to the extent that it creates concerns for the operating budget, 2 years from now when this funding runs out?
So I would say with CRF, no, because literally every single thing, one of the stipulations of CRF is that it had to be unbudgeted and extra cost related to the pandemic, right? So every single thing that is on CRF is a pandemic related expense. Most of, all the staffing, the vast majority of those staffing costs is, remote academy backfills, if you recall from, kind of the presentation in December, and also the community partners. I probably would be easier if we just actually go to the next slide, because I think it might answer people's questions, and I should have maybe jumped in and said that before. But some of the community partners costs, that's all extra too. If we get back to normal, those costs will not remain. But what you're saying is the critical question for how to use ESSERF, right? Because ESSERF doesn't have the you can't supplant stipulation, which is why we were able to charge custodial costs that were previously budgeted on. We were able to move that to that funding, which absolutely is something that we were going to, not have to put back, but most likely it was pre-existing costs that we were moving to a different funding source that we were going to later have to put back. So it's a risk depending on how we utilize those funds, but it is also a nice flexibility to have in dire financial times, right? It almost does allow it's more flexibility, but it's like a double-edged sword, right? So with CRF, that's not a concern. With ESSERF, that's something that is going to have to be discussed as part of the strategy.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I see Roberto has his hand up. Roberto?
Thank you, Chair. Miranda, I think I'm going to ask the flip side of Anna's question, and I wonder if it is on the next few slides. So even though these expenditures are pandemic related, some of them could potentially represent cost savings in the long term. Like I'm assuming, and maybe I'm wrong, but for example, the devices, right? Like the computers, even though those were a need for the pandemic, they do represent, because we won't have to replenish them in the next couple of years. So is there a way for us to see if there are any long-term cost savings from what we've spent with these funds?
Yes, I would think, I don't have that for you, but absolutely that's something we had discussed, actually, Javier and I had discussed a while back, when we were making some of these decisions. But I think you actually hit it. The devices are really one of, I can only think of two right now, but Javier, jump in if you think of others, but devices and buses. Those are the ones that jump out at me. And we can quantify that and see what, value that might bring in future years, but it's not, massive amounts of money, but it's certainly helpful. Certainly helpful.
And obviously you have to be careful, right, on not making those investments on an ongoing basis, because you do have to refresh. But we did specifically the technology investment. It's a $250,000 that we would have had to commit next year and the following year, that we probably won't have to commit. But at some point we have to start, refreshing our inventory, or we'll wind up in a situation where, then we'll have to refresh our whole inventory at one time. And so that's a strategy conversation that we will need to have as part of the budget allocations.
Kind of why capital and infrastructure investments are often a good use of these type of funds, because they are one-time expenses that do then sort of pay off and they have an investment value over time. Okay, I think we can move on.
Okay, so the next slide really speaks to your questions, Anna, on how we're going to spend the money, in FY21. And, this is a first cut at it. This is a proposal for discussion. But so looking at really the impact here of the rest of this year, we have this $4.5 million available that we didn't previously expect. So first and foremost, if you'll recall, and I do have it in the appendix if you want to go back to look at it, but the plan that was approved in December, after adding in that 1 month of partner costs and also adding in minimum wage, left us with about a $200,000 deficit that we sort of said, we know federal funds are coming, so, we feel okay with this. So the first, 200,000 covers that. You may also recall that we had budgeted $1.4 million in reserve funding sources to cover those continuation costs. So that I think the next thing that we consider doing is not spending those. And those funding sources were the $650,000 CARES contingency, i.e., SRF 1 balance. The other was the Medicaid reserve. We really don't want to spend that unless we have to. That is absolutely just super flexible, great reserve funds to keep in our balances for future years, particularly with some of the revenue challenges that we've been having with our Maine Care model till we get all that resolved. So we don't want to spend that unless we absolutely have to. And then there was also $85,000 from the foundation, and I need to circle back probably with Andy about that to see with this new situation if we want to preserve that, or I don't know exactly what all the stipulations are of that funding, but that's what makes up the other difference. So it was $650 CARES contingency, $650 Medicaid, and $100-ish from the foundation. So that's the 1.4. We are also hoping to proposing that we continue the partner programs through the rest of the year at an additional cost of $1.5 million. It was 1.8, but we already covered 300 in our original proposal for January. We talked about the food services revenue shortfall. So I want to allocate, other continuation costs that we were going to charge to the local budget, put that on CRF, put it back on CRF, and make space in the local budget to be able to cover food services costs to alleviate the pressure on that program. I'm putting this in at, kind of a placeholder of 800,000. It does not have to be that. That's a number that can be flexible. We can make decisions on that a little bit later in the year, but I think that's a good placeholder figure. And then finally, when you charge salaries to grants, there's an additional 18% retirement cost. And so I had taken that out of the costs as, budgeted on local, but putting them back on the grants, I have to add that back in. So that's an additional cost of doing business on the grant. So that's an additional 400,000. And so right there, we have kind of committed about 4.3 million of that 4.5, but we've done so, alleviating a ton of pressure on the local budget as well. So we could, end the year continuing all this, all of these programs, and end in a very good, strong position at the end of the year would be my hope, preserving all the balances that we can and not hitting our fund balances in ways we don't want to, et cetera. So leaving us in a really good position at the end of the year. So, and then, there's 200,000 or so left to consider, supplies or potential other areas that may come up. So this is sort of how things are taking shape for how to utilize the CRF funds this year. And any questions on this?
I don't see any hands. I think that all looks good. Oh, Adam has his hand raised. Go ahead, Adam.
Just want to say that's much better than where we were talking December. Looking good. Thank you.
Yeah.
A lot better.
Yeah, and I would say those are all like very perfectly reasonable allocations. It looks good to me.
Great. If only we knew this, in November. Think of all the different, conversations and reduced stress we could have had. But anyway.
It's like a little bit like a, 1980s soap opera where, you just like have to rehash everything that, and so. I guess the salient point that I want to make sure that you understand is in this allocation that you're seeing, this continues the partner programs through the end of the fiscal year. So we are going to bring that formally to you. At the board meeting, we had said that we would update you on, on the 19th about what we expected to see come through. So we will basically rehash this portion of the finance committee meeting with the full board on Tuesday in order to sort of give visibility to the fact that we are continuing those programs. Chair Figdor and I did talk about making a tweak to the programming where we ask families that can afford to pay for their children to attend rec begin to do so. So we are in the process of engaging with rec around that issue so that we can hopefully, that will reduce that 1.5 million a slight amount. It will not be a huge savings that will result from that, but that would potentially reduce that. So we are, when we talk about it on Tuesday, I will be talking about that as well. So by then we will have had a chance to engage with them and, evaluate the feasibility and the timeline for being able to do that and hopefully be able to quantify that to some extent.
Okay.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So allocating costs to CRF, is that the same as the idea you talk about the beginning, which transferring, which needs the authorization? Is that the same?
So you're asking if it's the same as getting the authority to transfer more than 5% from the general budget. It's unrelated because it is federal funding, but in some ways, conceptually, what we're doing here is we are moving expenses that we thought we were going to have to cover with our general fund. We're moving some of those expenses to the federal grants, to, in this particular case, the CRF grant. And then, so in principle, it's the same idea. It's money that was going to come from one place that, we're now able, because we have a savings, in this case, it's not savings, it's money that we weren't able to spend, but we now, with an extended timeline, can spend. And we're able to go and use those resources to relieve the pressure on the general fund.
Thank you. That makes sense. Thank you.
Should I move on?
Yes.
Okay. So this is FY21. This is, of course, under the assumption that CRF ends at the end of FY21. So looking beyond FY21, CRF is out of the picture, but we have, barely touched anything in our new allocation, except for, the original budgeted custodial salaries on SRF1, right? So we're left with a budget of $650,000 that carries contingency that we no longer need to spend this year, hopefully. We have that remaining. And we also have the whole allocation of SRF2. So we do have to consider that in FY22, we have the custodial costs on federal funding. If they do not continue on federal funding, they'll need to be added back into the budget. So we're thinking we go ahead and probably continue those costs on this same federal funding. It'll be about 1.3 million next year. If we use the first 650,000 of SRF1, since we have to spend it next year anyway, we use that first, cover 650,000 of that 1.3 million to keep the custodial positions on federal funding. The other half of that cost can go on SRF2. It'll utilize 650,000 of that 7.5 million. And then FY23, we don't have SRF1 anymore. We would have to budget that entire cost on SRF2. So really, that's all that's sort of committed at this point. Of course, that's up for discussion and strategic decision making as well. But that's sort of all that's sort of in the pipeline on these funds at this point in time specifically. So essentially, taking that into account leaves us with an estimated $5.5 million or so, 2.75 or so a year for the next 2 budget years if you want to spread it out evenly, to address all sorts of other areas that we need to address, learning loss and other things that will be part of the strategic budget discussion moving forward. So that's basically where this leaves us. Questions on that?
I don't see any hands raised.
Okay, I think this is the end of this part. Yep. So I don't know if there's any more discussion. We kind of had discussion along the way, but before we move on to the other next topic, if anybody has anything else to discuss, we could do that.
Any general comments on anything that we just discussed or questions? I think my only question is, so the custodial cost, that would be something that eventually we would have to go back into our local budget. And so it kind of grows each year. And so that the number that's going to have to go on back onto the budget is going to grow each year. Right.
Assuming, if it's continuing costs, yes.
Assuming we continue the same level of service and same, the same salary expectations and things along those lines. So, those are the assumptions that you saw there. Again, as Miranda said, that's the only thing today that we have on federal funding that we would either need to return to the general fund budget or use the federal funding that we are expecting to have to be able to continue for the length of time that we have that federal funding.
Okay. And I see Adam has his hand raised.
I think I'm going to be told we're going to talk about it in a moment. So just saw that there was that $5.5 million not allocated of ESSER 2. And my question is, beyond the things that we know that we're committed to and are necessary to continue our operations in this environment, are we starting to look at what are the additional things that we've learned that we need to do to meet the needs of our students and how those funds will be used? And you can tell me later, that's fine.
Yeah, I think that is, and Miranda mentioned that, learning loss, among other things, that's the money that we will be able to access to support our recovery efforts. So that's the plan, and we don't have it fleshed out, obviously, but that is that's the purpose of it.
And will that kind of be part of our budget discussion as we go along? Yeah. So just to flag that's kind of, I think, in the back of all of our minds, but I think it sounds like we're on the right track. Adam, did you have something else?
Yeah, I just want to flag with the learning loss. I had asked previously if at some point we could have a board workshop on all the different frames for understanding what is happening to students. I'm triggered by the idea of learning loss. I don't think it appropriately captures the holistic situation of what's happening for students, and I think I understand what it's trying to stay focused on, but I feel like it perpetuates harm instead of acknowledging what our students are going through. So as part of not only how we're going to use the money, but just from an educational board competency perspective, I would still like to have that conversation in some way.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears into APS if we don't have anything further on this topic.
Sounds good.
Okay. So just a couple of preliminary items to discuss about the FY22 budget. I'm sure everyone saw that the governor put out a proposed budget last week, and I've been trying to understand what that may mean for us. And honestly, before that happened, we had nothing to go on. I had no idea where we're going to land. We'd heard at different points in time that, there was going to be 10% cut to, education funding, right? So that clearly was not the case in what the governor proposed. So it's definitely good news for us. And I've tried to come to a place of a projection for what this might mean for our EPS funding. And so that's what I have here. And as I've said at the very bottom in big red letters, this is a projection. And this is, I do not have complete information, but I have decent information. And so I feel, fairly okay with this projection, but please do not expect that this is, in any way definitively our EPS funding for this year. There's any number of things that could make this be different from this projection, but I'm very encouraged overall at the result, which unfortunately at this point is still a projected loss in funding, but is nowhere near what the worst case scenario could have been. So I'll just go through kind of, with what I know and what's, kind of key factors that are driving the change in our EPS funding, to the extent this projection holds. So our EPS budget was about 18.7 million this year. So our valuation alone remarkably reduces our funding by about 5.3 million just on its own. So the governor's budget increasing the state share of education costs reduces the mill rate. Or I am hearing that it is projected at 7.9. It was 8.18 this year. So it's a substantial reduction. For us, it's substantial because our valuation is so high. So every 10th gets us back about $1 million. So we see 2.7 come back to us with that drop in the mill rate if that holds. It's great that the mill rate is going down. It's kind of sad that we still project, a loss in funding with the state increasing their, share of the cost of education. For us to still see a reduction is unfortunate, but you see why. It's the valuation right there at the top, right? So next, like everyone else in the state, changes in enrollment have dropped kind of the allocation portion of the model. And that results for us in about 1.9 million in losses. But I do want to say, that mill rate, I can't tell you how much, but that mill rate would not have gone down by that much, I don't think, if we hadn't had other districts also lose, funding in the side of the allocation that drives the cost of education, right? So if the cost of education is a little lower overall, the mill rate's a little lower and we actually gain more back, right? So all of these variables are interacting with one another. So nonetheless, on the allocation side of the house, the allocation side of the formula, those changes in our enrollment figures and in our free and reduced lunch figures and all the different enrollment related statistics show a loss of about 1.9 million. Now, to offset some of that, the state, I have been told, changed the one of the ratios in the formula so that the student teacher ratio is down, which actually gives back money to districts. And they did that with the intention of offsetting some of that enrollment loss. So that gets us back about 800,000. It doesn't get back the whole amount, but it offsets some of it. And then the rest of these are kind of more of the run-of-the-mill changes that we see every year. So the staff experience matrix increases our allocation by about 750,000. Other flat cost-based allocations, special ed in particular, was way up. That makes sense because of the large investment in Breathe. In that year, FY20, which is what FY21 is based on. But we actually saw a reduction in transportation expenditures last year, which unfortunately we're seeing again this year, which will affect our EPS next year. So all of these things, factor in. The net change from all of those allocations is about an increase of 1.5 million. Our debt service is down about 90,000. Of course, that will reflect on the cost side. So that's not, of concern. We should see, similar lower costs. And then that audit adjustment that I mentioned, which is really kind of, in theory, it's our pre-K, the hit to the pre-K allocation that we're going to see in next year that I mentioned earlier. So all of this together results in a reduction in funding of about 1.7 million. So that is the best projection that I have. It's not a, liberal, it's not a conservative projection. It's just me putting the numbers that I have in and making the best assumptions that I can with the information that I have. So to the extent there's nothing wildly off or nothing changes dramatically, I believe it'll be in this general vicinity. So, a month ago, I would have said we could lose $8 million. Think about if we lost 5.3 million and then the mill rate went up. It could have been a massively unmanageable story. So this is actually good. I think Javier called it good-ish news. So, it's not good news, but it's better than a lot of our expectations, actually. So.
And I think everybody understands these basic dynamics well enough, but I think that the important sort of numbers to keep in mind is, we expect an increase. There's just a general year-to-year increase in our costs that's, driven by by salary increases. So to do nothing differently will still amount to somewhere in the neighborhood of $3.5 to $4 million in additional costs for us as a district that operate our existing programming. Of course, with fewer students, we could potentially make some reductions and things along those lines. But just, to keep in mind that, our costs are going up. We're still going to see a decrease in state funding. So that means that the local tax base has to make up the difference between the budget that we need and what we get from the state. And so there will be, an additional cost associated with being able to run the budget. And, obviously, when you have less state money, that means that it requires more local money.
Can you, Miranda, remind me what the tax rate increase on the school side would be equivalent to make up this difference of 1.7, and then also what it would be to make up the difference plus, just say the figure that Javier just put out there, 3.5 million.
Well, Anna, it's been a little while since I looked at that, and that would have been probably a good thing to remind myself, because I had that probably top of mind last year, exactly how much each percent was. I want to say it was a percent a million. I mean, a percent per million. I that feels right to me, but I'm hesitant, but I can pull it up when we're having other discussion.
It's like 500,000.
Yeah.
500,000.
I think right now, because our local demand is somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 million, it works out really neatly that way. I think it will get increasingly harder to do, but I think that's exactly right. It's about $1 million is
1 point on the tax rate.
1 point on the tax rate.
Vaguely, yeah. I can get that okay. To you.
Yeah, that's just sort of the figure that is like most commonly in the dialogue between the council and the school board, as you know. So that's what makes me curious.
Yeah.
That's all, folks.
Any last comments, questions on this?
One question. Yeah. There's a lot of terms I haven't get used to, but what does it mean, change driven by valuation?
So the EPS formula believes that, well, the people who made the EPS formula believe that communities with higher valuations should contribute more to the cost of education. And Portland's valuation is going up at an extremely high rate these last couple of years, the last 3, 4, 5 years. And so when our valuation goes up, our state aid drops precipitously. And that's what you're seeing here. And this is the biggest drop valuation wise that we've seen. This is the biggest jump in valuation that we've seen. And it's a 2 years trailing 3-year average that's used. So now we are at the last 5 years, all the valuations are high. We previously had a couple of years where there was some lower valuations helping us pull down the average. Now we're at, just an extremely high 3-year average, even 2 years trailing. So that's what you're seeing here.
Mr. Yusuf, we are planning to have some briefings on, different departments and sort of some basic, language and metrics and things along those lines for new board members. So one of those will be on finance, and you'll have an opportunity to sort of delve into. I feel, this is one of the unfortunate things about, sort of how budgets work and how the political cycle works, is that people come in and they're confronted with all of these new, with all of these new terms and ideas without really having had a chance to onboard and get that information. So we're working on it, and you will be in a better position when you actually are dealing with a budget in a couple of months. But clearly, as Mr. Burke will tell you, or any of the board members will tell you, it's also the more times you go through it, the more familiar you are. And I appreciate you actually asking those questions, because it's easy to say like, oh, all of these folks know what they're talking about, I'm just going to not ask. But I think please continue to ask, and we'll do our best to provide that information. Some of this is super thick and wonky kind of stuff that we have amazing professionals that spend all of their time understanding it and learning it, and so it is pretty involved stuff. So, but we need to do our best to give you that information.
Thank you so much.
And Yusuf, to you and anybody who is interested, if you like, I'm happy to meet with anybody to give kind of rundown on the basics of this stuff. I've been finance chair now a few times, so I've kind of developed a little bit of a, just very general high level sense about it. So I'm happy to do that if you want to meet one-on-one or something like that through Zoom. Adam, see you've got a hand.
Yeah, clarifying question. Are we about to close the meeting? Is that the point where we're at? Okay.
Yeah, we have the budget calendar discussion, and that's the one last thing.
Okay, I'll hold my comment for after that. Thanks.
Did we have any more conversation about this? I see Emily's hand.
Emily.
I just wanted to say to Mr. Yusuf as well that I'm also always happy to talk about the budget and help out and answer any questions. And I'm so glad you asked this one. And this one is really the fundamental challenge with our budget, because we have very high property. The value of our property in Portland is very high. And that is the key metric that the state uses to determine how much funding we're going to get. And yet we have such huge needs across the district. So you really hit on it in terms of this key issue around valuation being determinative and very challenging. Less challenging this year, but it will be the great challenge we face as we put together budgets that address the needs of our district.
Yeah, and I apologize for just kind of glossing over that. I should have offered a little more detail on that as well. But just a last kind of summary point on the EPS formula. It's like extremely complicated in some ways, and then there's two sides of the formula. One side is super complicated, all these calculations and a million different numbers, and then the other side is the valuation times the mill rate. Those two lines that you're seeing at the top there, and those are what are impacting us really more than anything else. So it's an interesting kind of it's an interesting formula with a lot of complexity and so simple at the same time. And that's why we talk about the valuation and the mill rate as being really the keys to us at this point. So you'll hear that a lot moving forward.
Okay, I think
all right,
that's it.
Cool. So I'll move on to the last part of this, which is just a discussion of the budget calendar. So I posted 2 versions, and I think perhaps we should start with version 2, just because, I don't know, I feel like that one's a little bit preferable to the extent it works. So I posted those in the 3rd agenda item on board docs, but I'll also pull it up here. So this version has us starting with a presentation of the budget on March 16th. So I don't know if I should just go through it or, so the way this one works out, it seems to work out fairly well, but there's a lot to think about. So please stop me if I'm missing something pertinent. So basically we start with the presentation on the 16th, have that Thursday, have a finance committee meeting. So that's week 1. The week after that, we hear from the public, and then we meet with the council finance committee in a joint finance committee meeting. And then the following week, we would have the finance committee review and vote to the board. Now, of course, if there was an additional meeting required, there's time that week as well. So it's not super, super tight. We have, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday that week that potentially the finance committee could meet again if necessary. And then at the April 6th regular meeting of the school board, so we wouldn't need a special meeting for this. I'm sorry, and we would not need a special meeting for the presentation either. March 16th is a regular meeting. So on April 6th, it would be the public hearing. And then that Thursday, a joint finance committee meeting. And the following Tuesday, now this is where we would need a special meeting, because after the 6th, the next meeting of the school board is until after April vacation, I believe. So this Tuesday, April 13th would be needed to vote the budget to council, because we cannot wait till that last week, because we have to get it to the council by the 26th of April to meet the last Monday in April to the council deadline. So then the school board would present to the council on Monday the 26th, which is a council.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yep.
A special meeting, is that the Tuesday before April break, or that's during April break?
Tuesday before.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So then the last part is the council portion. Start with the presentation to the council on the 26th, and then city finance committee and the various council things that need to happen. And I haven't run this by Brendan or anyone on the city side yet, but this is a very similar schedule to how we initially proposed it last year. So I'm optimistic this works. And I checked with these are regular council meetings as well. So this looks like it could work to me. Any comments or concerns? The other version simply changes it to a presentation on the 9th, which builds in a little bit of additional time and flexibility. The main difference is, I think, just a longer chunk of time between instead of the 13th and the 26th, that's the 6th and the 26th. There's more time between those two pieces of the calendar, which I'm not sure if that's super helpful. It would give the board more time to discuss if necessary. That, builds in some flexibility. That's pretty much the only difference. It also makes us need 2 special meetings instead of 1. I can pull that up if you want, but those are the fundamental differences in the 2 versions. And, we don't have to make any decisions. We can just kind of mull this over. But I wanted to get an initial timeline out there to start working from. So any comments?
I think that looks actually pretty smooth to me.
To me, I think, I know you sent it to me earlier this afternoon. I saw it just before we started the meeting, so I haven't had a chance to really internalize it or anything. I want to make sure that it works on the city side. So I think that's obviously our next step is to, run that version 2 by them and see if that, because if I recall correctly, it's no different in terms of the sort of the city side. So it's, then it's really just a discussion, I think, with Anna and Emily around, do we want to start a week earlier on our end or give us another week and not have a special meeting? And I think that's the only difference. I will admit that I'm getting hives just thinking about it. So I'm probably not in the best place to, so I think that we're almost there, and it's just it's coming fast and furious as it always does.
I see Roberto put in the chat that he didn't understand the difference between the two. The difference is just that the initial presentation of the budget from the superintendent to the board would be on March 16th in version 2, but on March 9th, which is 1 week earlier in version 1. And so the question is, do we need that extra week? And I think, the ruminating on it is, does the superintendent need that week, more to prepare for his presentation of it to us? Or do we feel like we need to build in a little extra time in case we need more time with it in committee? I think those are kind of but I don't know that we need to solve that problem tonight. Just kind of think about it.
I think to me, the more fundamental piece is making sure that it works on the city side. And then I think that other conversation is one that the three of us, Ms. Victor, Mr. Varro, and I can have about with Miranda, about when to actually bring it to the board.
And then my only other thing is just, usually we do some kind of preliminary conversations with the council and with the legislators. Do we want to plan a meeting with the city? And do we want to plan to invite Mike Brennan into one of our meetings on this sort of early end?
I've been working to get time with the legislative delegation with Representative Brennan. I know he called me earlier today. I wasn't able to pick up his call, so I will, hopefully it's about that. So we are trying to get that scheduled. I guess the one thing I would say is I would really like to have our EPS projections in hand before we do that, because otherwise we're just dealing with, Miranda's really good analysis of the information that we have, but, we've been surprised before in terms of what actually comes in. So I think that would be critical, and that will also give us a little bit more time to, sort of fully understand what is our, sort of our roll-up budget and what the demands are. We usually have those conversations with the council when the council has, some of their own conversations and are in a position to, sort of say, like, what does their budget look like at the same time. So I do think that we absolutely have to have those conversations, probably not in the next couple of weeks. I think we're projecting to get EPS by the end of January, beginning of February. Is that your understanding, right?
Yeah, I've heard from folks at the state might be even sooner, but there's no expectation it's going to be delayed at all. So we should know within a couple of weeks.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll reach out to Nick and just kind of let him know where we are, that we want to, get something in the works for early February.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Anything else? Anything you guys need from us? Miranda, Javier?
No, I know that Adam wanted to say something before.
Oh, Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Clarifying question, is this Miranda's last meeting with us?
It's her last meeting with us as the executive director of budget and finance. We are still working through what are some of the potential things that Miranda will be able to do with us. And she is not going to go away without us having a roast for her at a board meeting. So while this may be the last finance committee meeting, she's coming back.
Okay, well, I'll take opportunity now again to say, Miranda, you're absolutely one of those exceptional professionals that Javier was referencing earlier. Your guidance through our budget processes in this unprecedented year, last budget cycle, which is my first. I mean, you consistently make the complex accessible. You consistently have had extraordinary patience with us as we've not only asked the clarifying questions, but also as we've pushed for different things that have come to us. So it's hard to me to imagine a better executive director of finance than you. And I just really can't say enough good things about my experience working with you. So thank you.
Yeah, I think we all echo those sentiments. This is the demands for this job, I think, are superhuman, and in a pandemic, that certainly adds to it. So, I mean, you've just been exceptional to work with, and we all really appreciate that. And we'll probably say it again a couple times before you leave.
Definitely say it more than a couple times.
Well, thank you all. I really, really appreciate your kind words. And I mean, I feel like I lucked out on this committee. We had an awesome committee, and I think everybody, I mean, and that's only, of course, because Adam and Roberto and you always were here as well anyway, right? So, but I feel like we had an awesome committee, just a super collaborative and just comfortable dialogue. And yeah, it's been really, really a privilege to work with all of you. And yeah, I do look, like Javier mentioned, look forward to helping in any way I can during the transition. So. All right.
Awesome. Okay. Well, on that note, we'll close the meeting, and everyone have a good night.
Good night.
Thanks, guys. Good night.
Good night.